It's December 31st, 2019, almost midnight. We hit 2020. This is the second segment of an hours and hours long broadcast made by Potkaars. And we're still on the English part of things. Let me show Potkaars, which is pot with candle, literally in Dutch. And phonetically it's podcast. And we've been talking to... There you go. We've been talking to Thomas Drake, John Kiriakou, Brittany Winner, who's a sister to Reality Winner. We've been talking to, who did we have? Bailey Lemon from Canada, Lorraine, and Marketa Gregorova, member of European Parliament. So if you want to see that, watch the first bit. We're moving now to the second part, and we're talking to Erik van der Beek. First of all, welcome to the studio. A bit odd, there's two Dutch guys talking English, yeah, but that's because there's a British guy here as well. So welcome. Oh. Welcome, Tarek Haddad.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So are you, I don't know where you are. Are you in London, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I'm back in London. I spent Christmas with my family in Jersey, which is a small island near to France. I don't know if people are aware. And yeah, I'm back in London where I'm based.
All right. So I ran into you reading Twitter and reading the news as the guy that wanted to report on what happened in Douma Syrië, and your employer didn't let you.
Yeah.
So we're going to get to that in a short while. Before we do that, maybe both you, Tarek, and you, Erik, can get us up to speed on what happened in Douma Syrië back in 2018, how that was portrayed in the press, and then walk through that chronologically to where we are now, and then Tarek relay how you tried to bring that story and what happened to you. So let's go back in 2018. What happened there, Erik, if you would start?
Well, there were reports about chemical attack on the city of Douma, or should I say a suburb of the Damascus, capital Syria. These reports came in. They were there were white helmets. They were sending out these pictures and videos about people found dead in this apartment building in the city of Douma. And then it was said these people were killed because of a chemical attack. This is how it all started. And then a week after that, there was this revenge attack of the US and France and Great Britain because they accused the government of Assad or the army of Syria of this chemical attack.
Right, so there's supposed to have been a chemical attack, and you're both fully knowledgeable. So Tarek, what happens when there's a chemical attack anywhere in the world? OPCW is flown in, right? So what happens there?
Well, I mean, I think this is, for me personally, is because, I have had a history of kind of being a bit skeptical about foreign policy, from the very beginning. I mean, I wasn't actually a working journalist at the time of Douma attack, but I was, I worked as a journalist at the time of the Khan Sheikhoun attack, which was previously, but it was, fairly similar circumstances, except in Khan Sheikhoun it was sarin, not chlorine. But, my instincts is usually, and my training as a journalist is you shouldn't just write exactly what the government tells you. It sounds like a very obvious and silly thing to say sometimes, but you'll be surprised how much this happens in journalism. It's, so-and-so. In this instance with Douma, it was the first accusations came from the French government and the French representative to the United Nations Security Council. 2 days after the attack, it was, we have, this is Assad with no evidence provided. So I think what happens is the majority of the world's media will report this story and say, okay, France. French intelligence say that it's Assad. No evidence is provided, but that story is essentially published in every newspaper in the world, and the whole world will believe that Assad is a brutal dictator that's launched this chemical weapons attack. my history and because of my understanding of these things, I'm always, please, 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 I beg, can we wait for the evidence? Unfortunately, that perspective is quite often neglected. And then, we find out always in these kind of atrocity propaganda is what they're called, is that, we discover usually 5, 6, whatever years later, the incidents weren't exactly as we were told. And there's a long pattern in history, and I can give your listeners some other examples of famous examples of how this has happened over and over again. But unfortunately, it's always, after the war is finished or, something like that. So my kind of emphasis as a journalist, knowing this history, has always been trying to push that new perspective of, let's get the evidence from the OPCW first before. And I remember, in Khan Sheikhoun, I wrote a piece saying exactly this. I was saying, because I understand it's sometimes difficult to say things that are, against your own government if you're a journalist. So, and I know the whole country was kind of, and the media establishment was pushing for war in Syria. So I know for me to say something contrary to that is very difficult. But all I tried to say was, before we go to war, let's ask for an independent investigation. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And I guess now in this scenario, we have an even more, dangerous situation in that, this is and I think I'm very happy to be speaking, with people in the Netherlands, because I think you guys will have a greater appreciation of this, which maybe people in the UK or United States might not. But, this is a very, very serious and important body. And, we shouldn't, this body shouldn't be used, politically to, manufacture consent for war.
Yeah, you're talking about the OPCW. Mm-hmm. Erik, do you think, apart from us, not too many people in the Netherlands are aware of this story?
No, that's the Dutch media until now has not reported about this. These whistleblowers coming forward. So that is the mass media.
The only thing we remember here, as a public memory of the OPCW, is last year when there was a press conference at our military intelligence service headquarters, I think, by our Minister of the Exterior, I think, and the British ambassador, saying they arrested a couple of Russians on the parking lot of the OPCW who were Wi-Fi hacking. And that took place shortly before the retaliatory strikes. Mm-hmm. And we only learned that last year. Now, OPCW is the body, the office that followed the Chemical Warfare Convention. So the United Nations decided together a long time ago to stop using chemical weapons as humanity, as humankind. So that's a good decision. And they built the OPCW, and it's in The Hague. That's why you're referring to the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. Now, OPCW reported on the Douma attack, and scientists went there, researchers went there, pretty much found nothing. They found trace elements of chlorine, but that was not what was officially reported. So, Tarek, what was in the official report by OPCW?
Yeah, I'll not specifically, I don't know the specific wording, but essentially one of the main findings that was included in the final report that went out to the media was that the canisters that allegedly contained the chlorine were dropped from the air. Now, this is very significant. I mean, it might seem like a very simple detail, but the fact that it comes from the air points the finger specifically at Assad's government, because they were the ones that were, using aircrafts to bomb the area, because that's where they were currently fighting.
Sorry to correct you here, Tarek, but this was not in the report. These canisters were dropped from the air. It was suggested, but it was not literally in the reports.
But I guess, yes, the implication that was given to the world or the media was that this is what took place, and that's, I guess, essentially what was then reported.
Yes.
And then, as we've now learned, one of the experts, Ian Henderson, who visited it, raised a strong possibility that these canisters were more likely placed than that they came from an aircraft. And they also raised significant concerns that there was tampering, that the canisters have been moved. And so all of those things were essentially whitewashed. And there's other details that were. I guess the other one is that the significant finding is that, as you've mentioned, the original investigators that went to the scene found trace levels of chlorine, whereas in the final report it said, it was something like it was substantially likely that chlorine was used. And there was other kind of small chemical details as well that essentially reflected this picture in simple terms that Assad's planes dropped chemical weapons canisters.
Adding to that, concerning the Henderson report, important detail, the canister didn't fit through the hole in the roof. So that was concluded by Mr. Henderson and his team. So this, to me, this was enough proof something was going on here.
I wasn't aware of that. That's
the stupid thing is
something so simply like that. It makes it even more ridiculous. But,
exactly. But we knew we could have known this already in 2018, right?
Yes.
And then OPCW scientists, no, you think? But anyway, I agree with you.
We could have suspected this in 2018, but then in 2019, with this Henderson report coming out, this, to me, it was almost final. This was not canisters dropped from the air. This was canisters being put there. So, to me, the conclusion was this was a false flag.
Yeah, I don't like that word, because false flag implies planted. Now, it could be. I mean, must be.
They were most likely planted, according to this report of Mr. Henderson.
False flag also implies that it was planted for a specific reason, and maybe for the retaliatory attacks. And that would be speculation into motive.
How do you see this, Derek? Was it a false flag or not?
I think I definitely understand. Rico's caution. And I think I personally try not to use the word false flag as well, just because it's one of those words that is, essentially makes you sound like a conspiracy theorist. So but I think, on the contrary to that, there is also very good evidence that, this was something that was staged. So the term that I prefer to use personally is atrocity propaganda, because that's the term in social science. That's the term in the history, of the people that discuss this in the history of journalism, in scientific literature. That's how it's usually referred to. False flag seems to be a fairly new word, and it might be justifiable to use, but I've just always usually used atrocity propaganda.
If we stick to facts.
Yes.
OPCW reported, and then inside OPCW, we now know, those scientists started to raise concern or complain through their internal channels. So that was not publicly known. They didn't manage to change anything until one or two went public as whistleblower. So anonymously. They talked to renowned journalists. And then a kind of a fact-finding, source-checking mission started from different angles, and more whistleblowers came forward. Until last week, even or a couple of days ago, WikiLeaks released a new bunch of information. So what was on what was reported by WikiLeaks just now?
Yeah, so there was several interesting things. I think, it gave us much more evidence that confirmed, the other details that were already unknown. But it's just, just the fact of having evidence of documents with the OPCW logos and emails of specific people, just, kind of logistical things like that, I think is very strong in terms of helping people see that this is real documents. And what, the propaganda and the, one thing that they never say when they're dismissing all of this story, which is why it's not run in the media, no one says these documents are not real, which is a very important thing. It's when you're listening to the propaganda, it's actually almost better to listen to what they don't say sometimes. So no one denies these documents aren't real. Some of the things that they have said are, very ridiculous. And thankfully now in the United Kingdom especially, there's, a group of academics that are, fighting against this the propaganda, and they're doing a very good job where the media is failing. So
this is the working group. This is the working group on Syria propaganda and media,
yes.
directed by Piers Robertson.
Yes, and I think for them, I haven't read everything that they've done, and I wasn't, funnily enough, I wasn't aware of them too much previous to this situation with me recently. But from what I can see, they've done a really good job of documenting this. Unfortunately, they've been smeared in the UK. There was in the Times of London, which is kind of one of our main newspapers, it had a front page story of kind of how Assad apologists are taking over the universities, and look at these evil academics that are defending Assad. But sadly, it's academics who are pursuing academic ideas and their science and that kind of thing that are getting smeared with these types of allegations. So sorry, I forgot the initial.
If I summarize, there was no evidence found of a chemical attack. However, it was reported by that United Nations body, OPCW, and then we're in a weird situation because a chemical attack could be the legitimization of counterstrikes that happened on the 14th of April 2018. Now that legitimization is gone, out the window, and OPCW is not responding. United Kingdom is not responding, France is not responding, United States is not responding, a bunch of journalists are responding. And I talked to Peter Hitchens, who's talked to one of the whistleblowers. You've done your research, you've done your research. And then, Tarek, here we go. You said to your employer, I've researched this thing, let's write a story about that. How did that go?
Yeah, I mean, so I kind of saw the same sort of treatment, I guess, as I just described with those academics it went through different stages, and I guess they're important to discuss for people that are not aware. One of the first things that was done was, here is this Bellingcat article, which kind of takes everything that's found in these, WikiLeaks releases, and it says this is essentially why all this information is rubbish. I don't know if people in the Netherlands will be too aware of Bellingcat, or if I need to explain too much about their background.
Finance from the Netherlands. They received $500,000 from Postcode Lottery.
So if I were to summarize Bellingcat in the general opinion in the Netherlands, would be that they're perceived as fairly trustworthy and a source of information for our government and the media outlets. That is not my personal opinion, but that would be how it's perceived in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Would you agree?
And
I agree.
I think one of my main aims of trying to speak to people is to trying to change that public perception, because, and it's a very similar thing with the white helmets now, which there's a lot of evidence of, it's not exactly what it seems. There is a big propaganda push to paint these people as something that they're not. You'll see that they'll have Oscar-winning documentaries. They'll be on Netflix. They'll go and do big interviews, but it's the sources of their funding or where their roots are always kept hidden from those reports. So if we just focus on Bellingcat, essentially Elliot Higgins started off as someone who was essentially a professional troll, and we've reached this. It's not a joke. He was a moderator on an online forum that was basically just trolling people. And I guess he was, I don't know if he had connections to, these organizations I will discuss in a second before, but for whatever reason, he was identified as someone that was very good at this. And so from there, I think he has, starts to have relationships with a think tank, the Atlantic Council, which is
NATO.
A think tank of NATO, essentially. And
he was a senior fellow there.
Senior fellow, exactly.
I don't know if he still is, but he used to be. He used to be, yes.
So let's move forward. So you wanted to publish for Newsweek. What happened?
let them finish about the guy's financing Bellingcat. He was just about to tell.
You know,
he was just about to tell.
Reason that I'm not so fair enough. Yeah, I want to know about that. That part I want to know about. But other than that, Bellingcat is not a source of information that I find trustworthy. Okay. So that's why I carry on.
Yeah. But I think it gets to an important part of this all in the media landscape. I'm just going to quickly put my charger on my laptop. Sorry. So yeah, I mean, my editors were essentially very happy to say, look, Bellingcat have done this, and like you mentioned, they have this reputation of, they're investigative journalists. They're trying to save the world by looking at these, scandalous atrocities. But when you look into their history, and we won't discuss it too much, people can find all of this online. They're funded by essentially the US State Department or people that, think tanks that make money from going to war, or think tanks that have an interest in going to war. If people want to find that more about that, they can. So, and I think the mass public believes a lot of things that they say, but also the more troubling side is, and this is what I discovered, and it's kind of been discussed more recently, is that editors across all the newsrooms, even though they might know about this dodgy funding, they will kind of trust Bellingcat more than their own journalists, which is what they did with me. So I wrote a response to the Bellingcat article. I said, point 1 is bad logic, point 2 is incorrect because of X, Y, Z. And I went through every single thing in the Bellingcat article. I sent this back to my editor, and when I gave him this, there was no more conversation. It was, I'm sorry. It's just we can't. I was never given any more reason. I think some people would have probably said, okay, this is not a story I can do. But for me, I just felt this was very, very, very important because of the reasons we described with the OPCW and the history and how important the body is. So when I kept pushing to try and do the story for about a week, I started to kind of be personally attacked as a journalist. So my day-to-day working environment was made very difficult for me. An editor was assigned to me, and every story that I wrote would essentially give me very, very long and difficult criticisms and would make me do much more extra things that normally I wouldn't have to do. I mean, just to put it into perspective, I have worked in journalism for several years, and I've never had any problems of editors saying, oh, my writing is not good enough, or the source is not good enough, or I need to find more information. If anyone wants to question this on me, I'm happy to provide the names of every editor I've worked with, and I'm sure many of them will say, he's done a fantastic job. And this is why in my article I give my full history of things that I've done, just to kind of show that in case people want to say, no, he's just a bad journalist. So when I only started to receive these attacks essentially when I was trying to say things that were difficult or that were not convenient for the US government. Those were the only times I started to be attacked. And so when I received a long email after a week of trying to report this, I received a long email saying, you did this wrong, you're having problems with your sources, all these things. This is the moment I had to resign, because I thought it was the typical thing of, you're attacking the voice of who it's coming from, and you're ignoring all the information.
Yeah. All right. That's sufficient, Eric?
Well, I'd like to ask Tariq if he received any signals from editors from other important titles, if the same has happened to them.
This has been one of the interesting things. Editors, but since coming public about this, I've and I'm not exaggerating, I've been flooded with messages from people. Some are just obviously just generosity and thank you, but several journalists have tried to tell me they've experienced similar things. I've spoken to a journalist at the BBC who's, because things have been very busy, I've yet to have the full conversation, but she's passed me a lot of seems like information that can be very useful.
And I breathe by an incident.
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, go on, please.
Yeah, and so there's others like it, and even just members of the public have sent me certain documents that I wasn't aware of before, and this is what's been great about this whole thing. And just I think, there's so much information that I thought I was unveiling this big story, and then 2 days later, my head was like spinning, because I was like, oh no, this is just the beginning of how much there is going on with this. It's one of those things that I think if people keep picking, it will keep unraveling.
Right. But about Douma,
Douma and just the state of the media in general.
There must be journalists, who've been in a situation like you are in. So trying to pitch the story and then being told, okay, we will not bring this story. So no people telling you they were in a similar situation.
Not specifically with this WikiLeaks stuff, no. And I think, without sounding arrogant about this, I think part of the problem is actually a lot of journalists don't understand propaganda. One of my reasons I became a journalist, like I've mentioned in my piece, was the Iraq War and how the media could get it so wrong. But I think, and so I studied propaganda a lot, and I was always very aware of government manipulation and how language, this is something that's not very well understood, but language is such a strong and powerful tool. Just to give you an example, Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, it's the legitimate, government. It's recognized by the United Nations as the legitimate government of Syria. Now, and this is not to excuse anything that he has done in the past or anything like that. I don't want people to say that I'm defending atrocities or anything like that. But he is, by definition, the legitimate government. Now, if you read any Western newspaper article about Bashar al-Assad, it will never say the legitimate government of Syria. It will say the regime.
Yes.
So this word is very loaded and makes you feel a very strong sense of like dictator, and it's always regime. Can you imagine writing a story in the Dutch press saying so and so from the Dutch regime, and it would never happen? Or I'm writing a story about Boris Johnson and the British regime. You will never see this happen in the newspaper.
And it's always rebels and or moderate rebels instead of Al Qaeda or yeah.
Okay, 2 years before they were terrorists, and it's very Orwellian. One thing one day, one thing another day.
We will be moving forward to our next topic of conversation. Otherwise, we're gonna extend this into 2020.
Just one question.
Yeah. Okay, hang on. So, what I'm going to do in a moment is stop this recording and start it again, because there's a technical issue thingy here. So we will reconnect to you in a moment as well, when we reach out to Voji Moric, who is calling in from Kazakhstan. However, my monitor thingy is screwed up currently, so that's why I'm interfering. Yeah, sure. Ask away. So let's wrap up this part of the conversation, and then we break, and then we come back. Eric.
Yes. How do you explain the mass media keep quiet about the whistleblowers and the WikiLeaks? How do you explain this? Because with Iraq, when it came through, Bush and had lied about weapons of mass destruction. The press reported this, but now they're not reporting. So how do you explain?
The thing is, we're in the middle now. So those weapons of mass destruction weren't there. Congress knew at the time, but we only learned it way afterwards. The cool part of this thing is that we're right in the middle. We know we're being lied to, my words, but So now they're all silent, and we're chatting away about this on New Year's Eve. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I was discussing this previously with Patrick Henningsen. It's almost like a catch-22, because the longer that they go kind of down this path without telling the truth, the harder it becomes to tell the truth. Because you see, if they were going to report the story now, everyone will be saying, why didn't you do anything? But to be honest, and it might sound like a very naive and optimistic thing, it's almost the only solution to this for them, for the news, because the longer this keeps happening, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger story. For example, do you think Russia is going to keep quiet about this, or China will keep quiet about this, or even other countries all over the world will start to say, hey, I mean, this is the OPCW, this is the United Nations body. Obviously, some countries will kind of keep quiet because they don't want to upset the US and the UK. But some countries are powerful enough to say, we'll keep raising this, and this story will continue to grow and grow. And it's just going to look stupid if they don't start covering it. And we're seeing already in the United States and the UK, I don't know the situation in the Netherlands, but a lot of people distrust the media already. And what I was trying to tell my editors is, listen, I understand the politics of saying something like this can be controversial for the newspaper, but the information is growing, and I haven't spoken to WikiLeaks, I don't know, but I know that there's other documents that are still to come. That will soon, I'm sure there will be another WikiLeaks. So I think what editors need to kind of have the conversation of saying is, okay, we've done a bad job previously, but we need to admit this going forward. Otherwise, the whole reputation of the industry is going to quickly collapse.
Yeah, the industry and the reputation of the United Nations, OPCW. I reached out to the Dutch envoy of the OPCW, invited him for an interview, and he declined. Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands declined that nobody's talking about it except us here on this little couch in my living room.
And just to be fair, actually, and I think this is an important point to note. I think the majority of the people at the OPCW will be respectable, honest people that are doing the best job they can. So I think just to be careful we don't say, this is the OPCW's fault. I spoke to some chemical weapons experts and people that work in this industry. I'm sure that they care very much about the work that they do. I think what's being happened is that the organization is being manipulated in a nasty way, and that's the point that we need to kind of make sure doesn't happen again. Because what happened is with this Douma situation, and this was reported by the former Guardian journalist Jonathan Steele. I think 3 days before the report was published, there was 3 United States Secret Service or intelligence officials that had a meeting with certain members of the OPCW, and they were the ones that kind of pushed that we have to, it has to be that Assad was responsible.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Tarek, we're gonna break it off here. We're gonna reconnect to the system, and then we'll be right back.
Okay.
Thanks. And we're back. So apologies for that. The technical issue which we still have. I can't switch my cameras as often as I'd like, or in the way that I like. So welcome back, Erik van der Beek.
All right.
And welcome back, Tarek Haddad from London. And welcome here, Vodje Moric.
Good to be with you.
Let's switch to that one. There you go. These are my remote guests. Yeah, I don't know where you're from. I think you're an American, but you lived in Mexico and now you're in Kazakhstan. Is that correct?
Actually, I have 3 citizenships. So I'm an American, Croatian, Mexican, and I'm living in Kazakhstan currently. And I'm not a spy, so.
Yeah, that's what you all say, right?
I thought I had a complicated background, but I think you win.
Vodje, Tarek, do you run a podcast by any chance or no?
No, I don't, but maybe in the future.
So I ran into Vodje through a former United Nations special rapporteur that I interviewed, Alfred de Zayas, and he was your professor, Vodje? I remember that.
Yeah, at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Yeah, he was my professor.
Yeah. So only then, through him, I learned of your podcast, Geopolitics and Empire. So just to start and to introduce you, what is that thing? How would you introduce your podcast? What do you aim to achieve with it?
Well, I was teaching in Mexico at one of the top universities there, the Tec de Monterrey, and I just started experimenting, trying to connect my university students with experts, a lot of like people I'm sure you guys talk about and interview, and I just thought, I started Skyping with them and just decided to do a podcast because I really want to know what's going on. And a few years ago, I just made it a weekly, regular thing. And I'm just trying to look at what's happening in the world, and I think people have a truth from people from the left, from the right, from neither, conservative, libertarian. I talk to everyone, and I think a lot of podcasts they kind of fall into this. They get like a label or a category where they only talk to one set of people, and then they interview a lot of the same guests over and over. And I just want to talk to people from all over the place. So that's what I've been doing for that past couple of years.
Okay, from your perspective and from your side of the world, what are the implications on a geopolitical scale of what's happening with the OPCW and the Douma gas incident?
Well, I mean, I think it's nothing new, and from the beginning, if you just kind of follow logic, like a false flag, right? Staged.
Here we go again. False flag.
People are scared of using this term today, but I've been using it in my class.
Derek is very scared of using it.
It was me.
He uses another term. Tell him.
I usually say atrocity propaganda, but they're very linked. Yes, I'm not disputing the word.
carry over, Wojciech, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of just would think about it from the beginning. That's what it was, and as President Assad said, the same day that the UN inspectors were coming, the same day that the alleged chemical attack was or one of them was to have occurred, was when the UN inspectors were coming. So none of that made any sense. And then if you just go back in history, all of the precedents are there from the Western powers, from the Gulf of Tonkin, which is declassified, from Operation Northwoods in Cuba. Even if they're willing to take out the UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, there's a great, I don't know if you've read that book on Hammarskjöld, very academic publication, and a lot of the evidence suggests that European and US powers took out the UN Secretary General because of what he was doing in Katanga and Congo. So, if you have all this context or precedent, and then you look at the Douma, it's kind of like, it's kind of obvious. And so, so I don't know where to go from here. It's like, what does it mean? I think they failed. And so they might just keep trying stuff like this at a low level, like a slow burn.
Tarek, before you joined, Tarek made a strong point saying, well, it's not the scientists, it's not the people working at OPCW that are doing a good job. It's the pressure maybe that the organization as a body came under, but this is the body that we have as humankind, preventing us from using chemical weapons on each other. So if that thing can't be trusted anymore, and that's the question I want to pose to everybody here: can we still trust United Nations OPCW the next time there's a presumed chemical attack? So who wants to answer that?
Well, I think, if it was to happen tomorrow, I think obviously not. No one, there would be a lot of question marks raised. But I think, and this is the important thing going forward, hopefully, is that, we start seeing enough of, public awareness about this, that, people are held responsible. I think that's the only real, I don't know if that's my naive kind of hope that everything's gonna be okay in the end or whatever, but I think in the end, if we're going to avoid the reputation of the OPCW being destroyed, I think that's what needs to happen, is that slowly that more and more information about this comes out to the point that this has to be addressed. And just from my experience in the last couple of days and weeks, I would say there is a lot of positive signs for that, just because, there are so many people that have, contacted me in different ways saying, thank you, finally, someone saying the truth about US foreign policy. Because I think, my dad is Arabic, and when I was writing about the initial story, he was saying, what's the point in all this? Everyone knows the US media lies, and everyone knows the US does these horrible things. I wasn't aware of the example that you gave, but there's others like it, such as David Kelly, who's the British weapons inspector that was killed. But I think what part of it is that a lot of people in the UK and the US don't actually know this history because of how deep propaganda runs. So I think part of the solution is actually to make people in the UK and the US more aware of it, and then there will be kind of consequences for at a local level. It's always very easy to criticize the government of another country, but it very rarely actually has impact. It's only when the people of that country start to criticize their own government that you might start seeing change.
Well, okay, not to be too critical on you then, but if I may, on your country, a certain publisher is being held at Belmarsh prison, awaiting an extradition trial without proper access to to be able to prepare his defense. So if we shift for a while to the situation of Assange, how did we get there, and how do we get out of it?
Well, I don't know how we got there is a very long story but I think essentially it was as soon as he released this information that was very damaging to the US government, there was a coordinated effort to make sure, there is a message sent to people like him of, this will not be tolerated in the intelligence community. Even though President Obama had a fairly bad record on journalists compared to, historically speaking, I think he'd imprisoned more journalists than any other president combined. But, he was a professor at Harvard Law School. And I think the people within his administration, drew a line on Assange to say, okay, we can't take this step to Assange because, what he did was essentially what journalists do every single day. And I think what's taken place is now that, Trump is in office, people within the State Department know that Trump is not really, doesn't really care about these issues, or that's not where his attention is going. He's been doing rallies almost every single weekend since he's become president. He's the first president to do this. He'll still go and do these campaign rallies as if he's trying to win another election. And there's so much, he's just letting people in the US State Department or NSA or whatever, they'll do what they want essentially without much control, oversight. So I think that's why you're getting this kind of, these charges when they were not brought under Obama. But I mean, regardless of what happened, I think it's definitely, the US intelligence just did not want this, this type of, or to tolerate this kind of leak in the future. But I don't know if you want to add more to that.
I did lead up to this. Are they going to tolerate this information about OPCW then? How is this going to? This is in closing on this topic. We're going to move on to the next guest. But how is OPCW think going to play out in 2020? Everybody, who wants to go first?
Well, I'll just say just briefly. I'm not too optimistic. Like I'm not saying I'm giving up. At least in the near term. Like I think I'll continue talking about it, and all of you should continue to talk about it and bring it up more and more. But but in spite of that, I'm not too terribly optimistic that much change will happen.
I guess maybe because I'm slightly younger than everyone, I'm still in my naive days. But I mean, not to kind of go too far away from politics and geopolitics. Personally, I spent the last 2 years trying to write a book about radicalization and polarization and things like that. So I became very interested in philosophy, and without going into too much detail, I think there is kind of a big cultural shift happening at the moment. And it's still very early, but you see that there's kind of change kind of happening with I think there's a move towards people understanding spirituality more, but at a scientific level, not kind of superstitious level. There's philosophers that are really discussing, people like Jonathan Vervaeke, I believe, who people should look into, or people like Jordan Peterson, who I guess might be more familiar to a lot more people. Because of things like that, there's this kind of effort or this movement of a lot of people kind of wanting to tell the truth more. You're seeing, so even though the media is failing, you're seeing podcasts, they're becoming this, this great, powerful thing for freedom of speech. If you look at the most popular podcasts across the world, they will be the ones that are discussing these issues that are not being discussed in the media. If you look at, the Joe Rogan podcast, the number one podcast in the world, they will talk about Syria fairly honestly. They'll talk about, obviously they talk about many different things, but they'll talk about how the mainstream media gets several things wrong. They'll talk about Twitter censorship. They'll talk about, many different interesting ideas that don't get the adequate attention in the media. And so I think this is part of the reason why this story has kind of been the way it has, is that there's definitely this shift to podcasts. And I'm thankful to you guys and everyone else that's kind of, freedom of speech and that kind of hope is continuing in that channel.
Okay, that's positive, Rochi. So that's you and me, buddy. and the big ones like Joe Rogan and the other ones that are out there. Okay, Roger Moric and Tarek Haddad, thank you so much for being here and relaying this story. And keep up the good reporting in the next year.
And let's all sponsor these guys.
Yeah, give us an hand. Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you guys. Take care.
Bye.
That was a story.
Yes.
Thank you for being here as well. Any last remarks that you want to make in here, Eric?
Let's all sponsor these guys.
Let's all sponsor these guys.
No, because at Tariq, he just started as an independent journalist.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I can
And
bring him back on.
And he's okay.
No, we have to switch. I feel people have lined up already. We're running out of time, so we are moving to the next topic. Thank you for being here, Eric. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Do great reporting in the next year.
Thank you.
Best wishes for the new year.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
And,
Thank you.
Hij was net als independent journalist begonnen, dus hij had een oproep gedaan voor mensen om hem te sponsoren.
So for our English-speaking guests, this is the end of the English segment. So I hope you know Dutch. Other than that, if you don't, have a great new year. Sponsor these guys, like what Eric said. Sponsor Potkaars. Sponsor any independent journalist.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. And this is where we do the magic trick and go to Dutch. But I'm going to pause the recording because I'm going to switch the studio. So be back in a sec.
Bye.